They say a mother's hands are the first home a child ever knows. If you looked closely at mine, you would see a map of unyielding persistence, thick calluses on the fingers, joints swollen from chronic arthritis, and faint white scars from sewing needles over nearly 40 decades. For 38 years, my life was measured by the rhythmic hum of a vintage Singer sewing machine and the rustle of fabric. In my small shop, Miller's Tailoring, nestled in the quiet town of Millbrook, Ohio, I stitched exactly 14,200 custom wedding gowns. I watched generations of young brides walk out my door, while I quietly wiped sweat from my brow and massaged my aching lower back. I never complained. Every prick of the needle and every dollar earned was meant to secure a brighter horizon for my only child, my son, Greg. When my husband passed away before Greg finished middle school, that sewing machine became our sole lifeline. I poured every ounce of my energy into raising him, wanting him to experience a world where hands didn't have to bleed against coarse fabrics to survive. When Greg earned his degree and moved to California to build a career in finance, pride swelled in my chest. For a long time, our weekly Sunday evening calls were my anchor, but slowly those calls began to change. The warm chats grew shorter, replaced with quick text messages, and then long periods of silence. I convinced myself it was simply the natural rhythm of a young man carving out his own empire under the golden sun of the West Coast. Then came a Tuesday afternoon in late October, shattering the quiet routine. I was bent over a heavy velvet hemline when my phone buzzed on the cutting table. It was Greg. His voice carried a strange, nervous tremor that immediately made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't ask about my health. Instead, he circled around a conversation he was clearly terrified to finish. He was engaged to be married to a wonderful woman named Chloe, he said, and they had found a place, a stunning, immaculate property on Elmwood Drive in Irvine, priced at $850,000. Excellent neighborhood, top-tier schools. But there was a massive hurdle. Lacking a substantial credit history and crushed by high debt, the banks had slammed the door in their faces. They couldn't pull together the down payment, and their dream of a home was slipping away. My heart performed a heavy, sinking drop. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I didn't pause to calculate what my own old age would look like without a safety net. I simply looked around my modest living quarters, looked down at my gnarled working hands, and made a silent vow. A mother does not watch her child drown when she still has the strength to swim. Within 48 hours, I set machinery into motion that would permanently erase the life I'd built in Ohio. I liquidated every single asset. I closed out my personal retirement account, yielding $220,000. I sold my modest four-room cottage on Maple Street quickly for $380,000. To cover the remaining gap, I took out a commercial equity loan against my old sewing workshop for $250,000. When the bank wires finally cleared across state lines, the exact sum of $850,000 in hard cash sat in the escrow account, purchasing the Elmwood Drive property outright, free of any bank mortgage. I handled the legal framework with absolute clarity. With a local title agent, I ensured my name alone remained recorded on the official grant deed as the sole legal owner of the property. However, to ensure Greg and Chloe could establish their residency with dignity, I drafted a formal resident lease agreement, charging them a symbolic rent of just $1 per year, while placing all utility bills in their names. A week before I boarded the bus to California, carrying the paperwork in a worn leather folder, Greg drove out to visit me in Ohio for a brief afternoon. As he stood in the empty, echoing shop, the sewing machines already sold, the shelves stripped bare, he hugged me tightly. In that fragile moment, before ambition completely rewired his conscience, he whispered words that I engraved deeply into my soul. He pulled back, looked straight into my tired eyes, and said, "Thank you, Mom. You are the best mother in the world, and I promise you will always have a permanent home under our roof no matter what happens." I smiled, patted his broad back, and replied with calm reassurance, "This is your nest to build your future, son. The deed is simply my way of standing guard, ensuring that no matter how rough the world gets outside, you will always have a roof over your head." Little did I know, those exact words would soon be twisted, weaponized, and thrown back in my face like shattered glass on a concrete porch. 3 weeks after wiring the funds, I packed my old sedan and drove 2,200 miles across the country, from Ohio to California. My lower back had finally given out after decades of bending over sewing tables, forcing me into early retirement. And I wanted to surprise Greg with the news while seeing the home we had built together. When I pulled into the driveway of the immaculate property on Elmwood Drive in Irvine, the afternoon sun gleamed off the manicured lawn and expensive landscaping. Greg opened the front door, holding a crystal glass of red wine, his expression instantly draining of color the moment he saw my faded leather suitcase sitting on the porch. From the expansive living room, I could hear the murmur of refined voices. His future in-laws, Arthur and Evelyn Vance, were seated on the imported Italian leather sofa, sipping cocktails in an environment that felt entirely foreign, cold, and unwelcoming. That evening, the tension around the custom walnut dining table was thick enough to cut with sewing shears. Evelyn Vance took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, looked down at my hands resting on the edge of the mahogany surface, and made sure everyone at the table heard her cutting remark. "You really ought to be careful where you place your hands, Martha. This Italian walnut table is custom finished, and rough, fabric-stained fingers like yours leave scratches that cost a fortune to buff out." I looked across the table at Greg, expecting him to say something, anything to defend the mother who had given up her entire livelihood for him. Instead, my son kept his eyes glued entirely to his plate, quietly chewing his steak in complete silence, choosing cowardly compliance and social cowardice over basic human respect for the woman who bore him. The full weight of what had happened the next afternoon while Greg was out at his corporate office. Noticing a leaky pipe dripping steadily beneath the garage sink, I went looking for a wrench to fix it so I wouldn't be a burden. Pushing open the side door of the garage, my eyes landed on a heavy black plastic trash bin sitting next to the recycling containers. Inside, crammed haphazardly among discarded cardboard boxes and packing tape, was a white garment bag. I pulled it out with trembling hands and unzipped it. It was the custom wedding gown I had spent 300 sleepless hours hand-stitching with ivory silk taffeta and delicate lace as my personal wedding gift for Chloe. The hem was stained with dirt, and it had clearly been tossed aside like household garbage because it didn't fit the modern, superficial aesthetic of their new high society circle. Standing alone in that damp garage, holding the ruined fabric against my chest, the cold reality of my son's utter ingratitude settled deep into my bones. The final blow came the following evening, delivered with calculated, surgical precision. Chloe walked into the kitchen where I was quietly drinking a cup of tea, dropped a crisp legal document onto the quartz counter, and slid it toward me with a manicured fingernail. It was a pre-drafted quitclaim deed, legally designed to strip my name entirely from the property title and transfer full ownership directly to Greg and Chloe. "Let's stop pretending you actually own this house, Martha," Chloe said, her voice dripping with sharp, unmasked condescension. We consulted a real estate attorney. Your name on the deed is just a formality we tolerated to get the closing done. Sign it over tonight and we can all move on with our lives." I looked up from the paper, my voice steady, cold, and quiet, as I pushed the document back across the counter. "No, I bought this roof over your heads, and my name stays where it is." Hearing the commotion, Greg walked into the kitchen, his face flushed with anger rather than shame. Before I could say another word, Chloe grabbed my old leather suitcase from the hallway, hauled it out the front door, and flung it onto the stone pathway. Greg followed her out, picked up the suitcase, and hurled it violently down the steps into the pouring rain that had just begun to streak across the Southern California sky. He looked down at me through the storm, his eyes completely devoid of warmth, delivering the final, merciless blow. "Just go back to Ohio, Mom. You staying here only embarrasses us in front of Evelyn and Arthur." As I stood on that wet pavement, with the rain soaking through my coat, watching the heavy oak front door slam shut in my face, something inside me finally broke, and then hardened into absolute, unbreakable stone. They thought they had defeated an old, tired seamstress. They had no idea what kind of steel was woven into my soul. I did not shed a single tear as I stood on the wet pavement under the unrelenting Southern California rain. Instead, I knelt down on the cold asphalt, my fingers stiff and aching from decades of handling heavy fabrics, carefully gathered the scattered contents spilled from my broken suitcase, spools of Gutermann thread, a handful of steel sewing needles, a tape measure, and a few faded photographs of my late husband. I picked them up one by one, methodically placing them back into the cracked leather lining, refusing to let my dignity wash away in the gutter. Before I could finish packing my belongings, the deep rumble of a heavy-duty engine cut through the hiss of the storm. A large tow truck with flashing amber lights pulled over to the curb, hazard markers slicing through the gray downpour. The driver's door pushed open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a high-visibility jacket jumped out holding a large golf umbrella. As he stepped closer under the street lamp, I recognized his face through the water streaming down my glasses. It was Mateo, a roadside assistance mechanic whom I had met 6 years ago back in Ohio when his daughter's prom dress tore down the seams just hours before the dance. I had stayed up until 3 in the morning fixing it for free, refusing every dollar he tried to offer. Mateo took one look at my drenched coat, the ruined suitcase, and the lit-up windows of the grand house behind us, and the situation registered instantly on his face. He rushed forward, dropping his umbrella over my head, and gently placed a heavy, calloused hand over mine as I reached for a loose spool of thread. His voice carried a firm, deeply respectful authority that stopped me cold. "Leave those be, Miss Miller. Your hands were meant to create magic, not to pick up trash of a cold street." Without waiting for an argument, Mateo scooped up my battered suitcase, loaded it into the back of his tow truck, and helped me into the passenger seat of my old sedan. He hooked up my car to his rig and drove us away from the wealthy, sterile neighborhood of Irvine, heading deep into the heart of East Los Angeles. He brought me to a quiet, unassuming apartment complex where life moved at a genuine, human pace, far removed from the cold ambition and superficial standards of my son's new upper-class world. There, Mateo introduced me to the property manager, a warm-hearted 65-year-old Latina woman named Rosa, who ran the complex with a mother's fierce compassion. Within 20 minutes of arriving, Rosa had checked me into room 2B, a modest, compact studio apartment with peeling wallpaper and a small window overlooking a brick alleyway. Just as I was setting my damp suitcase on the narrow metal bed frame, a gentle knock echoed at the door. Rosa stood on the threshold, holding a steaming ceramic plate piled high with homemade pork tamales wrapped in corn husks and a deep bowl of rich, garlic-scented chicken soup. She didn't ask a million questions or pry into my private pain. She simply smiled with eyes that had seen their own share of life's storms, set the food on the small wooden table, and told me to eat while it was hot. The next morning, looking for a way to occupy my hands and earn my keep, I walked down to the ground floor storefront, a modest neighborhood laundromat and dry cleaning shop operated by an elderly man named Ray. When Ray saw me examining a stack of garments waiting for mending, we struck a simple, honest agreement. I sat at a small folding table near the front counter, using a basic handheld needle and durable thread to mend torn belt loops, replace missing brass buttons, and adjust jacket linings for local factory workers, mechanics, and students. Ray insisted on paying me $50 a day for my labor, money that felt infinitely cleaner and more honorable than any luxury afforded by high society deception. That evening, sitting by the narrow window of room 2B as the LA traffic hummed outside, I pulled my broken leather suitcase onto my lap. Using a sturdy saddle stitch, I carefully mended the torn side seam where the leather had split during the rain. As I pulled each knot tight, a profound clarity settled over me. True self-respect does not reside inside a multi-million-dollar mansion or depend on the approval of ungrateful children. It lives entirely within the honest labor of a person's own hands, no matter how worn, calloused, or bruised those hands might be, proving that genuine human dignity can never be thrown away like discarded garbage. The hum of the old Maytag washer in the corner of Ray's shop was a familiar, hypnotic rhythm. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of heavy, humid day where the air felt thick enough to chew. Ray was struggling with a stubborn zipper on a heavy canvas jacket, his knuckles red and swollen from decades of hard labor. I walked over behind the counter, grabbed a pair of heavy-duty pliers, and helped him yank the brass teeth back into alignment with a sharp clack. Ray let out a long, ragged sigh of relief, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a calloused wrist. He reached into the battered metal cash box to hand me my daily wages, but his fingers only brushed against a few damp quarters and a crumpled receipt. "Damn it, Martha," Ray muttered, shaking his head. "I'm short on the loose change today. Take this instead." He slid a small, slightly damp piece of pinkish paper across the Formica counter. It was a quick-pick Powerball ticket, printed hastily by the machine next to the register. It cost $2. I looked at the ticket, then looked up at Ray's tired, apologetic eyes. I didn't want charity, but I knew Ray's pockets were just as empty as mine. I took the slip. Instead of tossing it into my purse to be forgotten, I pulled a yellow tailor's chalk from my apron pocket. With steady, practiced hands, I crossed out the random computer-generated numbers and wrote in my own. I chose the numbers that mapped out the architecture of my entire life. 09 for the day my late husband drew his last ragged breath in a charity hospital ward. 14 for the bitter autumn morning I unlocked my very first drafty tailoring shop. 22 for the day Greg was born, before bitterness hollowed him out. 38 and 58 to mark the exact number of years my fingers had bled against needles, thread, and rough denim. For the final Powerball number, I penciled in 12, the month the bank foreclosed on our family home. That little piece of paper wasn't a gamble. It was just a graveyard of old memories, tucked safely into the pocket of my canvas work apron. Hours later, the clock on the wall of my cramped 2B boarding room read 11 sharp. The room smelled of stale instant coffee and damp wool. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring blankly at the flickering 19-inch CRT television in the corner. The local news anchor was leaning forward into his microphone, his voice dropping an octave for maximum dramatic effect. The Powerball jackpot, he announced, had rolled over for 11 consecutive weeks, ballooning into a staggering, unimaginable sum. A single winning ticket had just been sold right here in Los Angeles County. The numbers flashed across the screen in bright, blinding yellow font. $1.2 billion, a lump sum cash payout of $650 million after taxes. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Slowly, deliberately, my hands shaking so violently the paper rustled like dry leaves, I pulled the crumpled ticket from my apron pocket and smoothed it flat against my knee. I didn't scream. I didn't jump up and down, and I certainly didn't laugh like someone who had just won the cosmic lottery. I looked at the television screen. Then I looked at the ticket. Then back to the screen. 09, 14, 22, 38, 58, Powerball 12. Every single digit matched. I sat there in the dead silence of that tiny room for what felt like hours. I didn't call my son. I didn't call Greg. I knew exactly what would happen if I did. He would show up at my door with his hand out, his eyes wide with greed, demanding his share of a miracle he never lifted a finger to earn. Instead, I placed the ticket gently beside my worn-out tailoring ledger, right next to a cracked ceramic tea mug. I stood up, walked into the cramped bathroom, and splashed ice-cold water over my face. I stared at my reflection in the foggy mirror, the deep lines around my eyes, the silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, the sheer, crushing exhaustion of a woman who had been ground down by poverty for 60 years. I walked back out, sat down on the edge of the bed, and read those numbers a fourth time. Then I reached for the rotary phone on the nightstand. I didn't dial a family member. I flipped open the heavy yellow pages of the telephone directory, running my finger down the columns until I found the name I was looking for. Sarah Jenkins, a high-powered real estate and asset protection attorney downtown. I picked up the receiver, dialed the number, and let it ring in the dark. When a crisp, professional voice answered on the other end, I didn't stutter. "Mrs. Jenkins?" I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a pair of sharp steel shears. "I need you to help me hide $650 million from my son before he destroys what's left of us." The air inside attorney Sarah Jenkins' office on Wilshire Boulevard didn't smell like paper and ink. It smelled like cold, calculated reality. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the relentless Los Angeles sun beat down on the endless grid of traffic below, a distant hum that felt a million miles away from the quiet destruction playing out inside this room. On the mahogany desk between us lay a thick stack of certified documents, retrieved straight from the Orange County Assessor's Office, official public records that laid bare a level of greed I still refuse to fully comprehend. Sarah didn't look at me right away. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning lines of legal boilerplate with the practiced precision of a surgeon inspecting a malignant tumor. Every tick of the antique wall clock seemed to echo off the minimalist walls, marking the seconds ticking away on a life I had spent decades building. When Sarah finally looked up, the expression on her face wasn't anger. It was something far more chilling, the absolute stillness of a professional trap about to snap shut. She slid a certified copy of a property deed across the mahogany wood, her voice dropping into a professional register that brooked no argument as she explained how an electronic filing portal had been used 10 days prior to lodge a forged quitclaim deed, transferring the entire $850,000 home directly into Greg and Chloe's names. The words hung in the air, dense and heavy, refusing to dissolve. My own house, the walls where I had raised a son who now calculated my worth by the square footage of my kitchen. Sarah brought the flat of her palm down hard against the polished wood of the desk, her eyes flashing with righteous indignation. Under California Penal Code 115, filing a forged legal instrument constituted a serious felony, compounded by severe elder financial abuse that carried 3 to 5 hard years inside a state penitentiary with zero chance of probation. The sheer weight of the statute vibrated in the room, 3 to 5 years in a prison cell. For a fleeting second, the image of my son, the boy I raised alone after my husband passed, the child I sacrificed every seam of my youth to put through university, flashed through my mind in handcuffs. My throat tightened and a sharp ache settled behind my ribs. Every instinct of motherhood screamed at me to protect him, to shield him from the destructive furnace of his own unbridled greed. I looked across the desk at Sarah, my breath catching before my voice steadied into a cold, unyielding resolve. I refused to sign a criminal indictment or act as my own son's executioner, but I would not let them steal what I earned with my own sweat either. I instructed her to bypass the criminal courts and file an immediate unlawful intainer notice, granting them a strict 3-day deadline to vacate the premises or face legal eviction for housing fraud. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, measuring my resolve before a small, grim nod of respect touched the corners of her mouth. She pulled a fresh legal pad toward her, noting that we would hit them where their social arrogance hurt the most by serving the formal notice first thing the following morning. With the eviction gears set firmly in motion, we turned our attention to the $650 million sitting securely in federal escrow. Sarah drafted a bulletproof legal vehicle called a revocable living trust, naming it the Needle and Thread Trust to honor the decades of calloused labor that had built my life from the ground up. Because California state law strictly mandates that lottery winners cannot permanently hide behind anonymous LLC structures, Sarah prepared me for the inevitable flashpoint. The press conferences, the television cameras, and the blinding glare of public exposure were fast approaching. I stood up, buttoned my modest wool coat, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling office window. Down below, the endless streams of traffic flowed along the Los Angeles freeway, oblivious to the storm brewing in our favor. I had spent 60 years hiding in small sewing rooms, letting others trample over my dignity. But as I looked out at the city skyline, I realized something fundamental. I was no longer an invisible, tired old seamstress, discarded in a garbage bin. I was a survivor, and when the blinding lights of the world turned towards me, I would make sure they saw every single thread of steel woven into my soul, knowing the final reckoning had only just begun. The golden twilight over Irvine usually brought a quiet, manicured stillness to Elmwood Drive. But tonight, the backyard of my former house was pulsing with the thumping bass of deep house music and the brittle, piercing laughter of Newport Beach socialites. Chloe had pulled out all the stops for her grand cocktail celebration, parading around in a designer silk dress as if she owned the world. Out on the paved patio, beneath strings of fairy lights, her father, Arthur, stood by the outdoor kitchen with a glass of scotch in his hand, loudly regaling a group of wealthy real estate investors with a twisted version of my departure. He chuckled, waving a hand dismissively as he loudly claimed they had finally managed to clean up the pathetic mess left behind by a stubborn, uneducated tailor who couldn't even adapt to modern society. Greg stood beside his father-in-law, nodding along with an arrogant grin, holding a chilled beer bottle while accepting congratulatory handshakes on their so-called total ownership of the estate. Across the patio, a massive 70-inch flat-screen television mounted against the exterior wall hummed with local news coverage, mostly ignored as background noise, while guests clinked their crystal glasses and discussed stock portfolios. Then, right in the middle of a toast, the broadcast abruptly cut to a breaking live feed from the downtown California television studios. The screen flashed with the bold, flashing graphic of the historic Powerball jackpot announcement, $1,200,000,000. And stepping out from behind the heavy velvet curtains onto the brightly lit stage wasn't some corporate executive or a young, polished celebrity. It was me. I stood there, under the blinding white lights, in a tailored midnight blue wool suit, every sharp seam hand-stitched by my own fingers during long, sleepless nights in the back room of my old shop. My posture was straight, my head held high, and my hands rested steadily on the oversized cardboard check bearing the staggering numbers. There was no confusion, no hiding behind lawyers or shell companies. The state of California required transparency, and I had chosen to step directly into the blinding glare of the public eye. In the backyard on Elmwood Drive, the sound died away as if someone had pulled a plug on the entire neighborhood. Chloe was mid-gesture, her arm raised to toast the crowd with a crystal goblet of expensive red wine, when her eyes accidentally caught the massive television screen. Her arm froze midair. Her fingers went completely limp. The crystal goblet slipped from her grasp, crashing hard against the polished marble patio floor, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces as deep red wine splattered violently across her expensive designer shoes. Beside her, Arthur choked on his scotch, his jaw dropping so hard his plate of gourmet hors d'oeuvres slipped from his fingers and hit the stone tiles with a sickening thud, his face turning a sickly, washed-out gray. Greg went entirely rigid, the color draining from his face, as the beer bottle slid straight out of his paralyzed hand, clattering loudly against the concrete before rolling away under a patio lounge chair. The suffocating silence that fell over the party was absolute, broken only by the clear, calm voice echoing from the television speakers as I addressed millions of viewers across the country. My phone vibrated violently against the coffee table in my Los Angeles hotel suite just minutes after the broadcast concluded. I glanced down at the illuminated screen. The caller ID flashed a single word: Greg. I let it ring twice, watching the digital numbers pulse in the quiet room before calmly sliding my thumb across the glass and bringing the phone to my ear. Greg's voice wasn't arrogant anymore. It was a hysterical, broken scramble of tears, gasps, and desperate pleading. "Mom, oh my God, Mom, I just saw you on live television. Please tell me this is a joke. Please, I am so sorry, Mom. I've been under so much pressure at work lately. My mind hasn't been working right. Please come back home. Please. Chloe and I have already packed up the guest room. We cleaned out the master suite just for you. Just please come back home where you belong." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scream or curse. I simply let the dead silence stretch between us for a long, agonizing second before I answered him in a flat, bone-chilling tone, delivering the final blow. "Did you pay your first dollar of rent on that house this month yet? Or do you still honestly believe that lazy forged signature on the quitclaim deed has any legal power left?" Before he could stammer a single broken syllable of an excuse, I hit the red button, ending the call, and blocked his number forever, knowing the trap had finally closed completely. The morning air on Elmwood Drive was crisp and quiet, carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus from the nearby canyon. But that artificial peace didn't last long. At precisely 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, a heavy-duty commercial moving truck rolled down the manicured street, its massive engine rumbling loudly before coming to a complete halt right in front of the driveway. Behind it pulled a sleek obsidian Cadillac. The door clicked open and I stepped out onto the sunlit pavement, my posture straight and my gaze fixed immovably on the front porch of the house I had paid for with my own sweat, only to be locked out of just a few days prior. Sarah Jenkins stepped out of the passenger side, her leather briefcase in hand, accompanied by two uniformed Orange County Sheriff's deputies whose presence instantly transformed the neighborhood morning calm into an undeniable legal reality. The front door of the house clicked open. Greg stumbled out onto the porch, looking like a shattered ghost of the man who had ordered me out into the rain. His eyes were deeply red-shot, shadowed by dark circles from a sleepless night of absolute panic, and his hair was totally uncombed. Peering nervously over his shoulder was Chloe, wrapped in a silk bathrobe, her face entirely devoid of makeup and stripped of every ounce of the smug, untouchable arrogance she had brandished like a weapon just days ago at her cocktail party. They looked less like the masters of Newport Beach high society and more like terrified trespassers caught red-handed in a stranger's home. Sarah didn't waste a single heartbeat. She marched straight up the paved walkway, the crisp click of her heels echoing off the brick walls, and pulled a formal legal document from her portfolio. With a voice that carried clearly across the front lawn, Sarah read the unlawful detainer notice aloud, detailing the immediate breach of contract, the unauthorized occupancy, and the fraudulent paper trail designed to circumvent property laws. She fixed Greg and Chloe with a cold, unyielding stare as she delivered the final ultimatum. You have until exactly 12 o'clock noon to pack every single personal belonging and clear out of these premises. If a single item remains past that deadline, this temporary stay is revoked, and the felony charges for document falsification under California Penal Code 115 will be filed directly with the Orange County District Attorney's Office this afternoon. I didn't say a single word as I walked past the deputies and climbed the front steps, my boots clicking against the polished tile floor. The interior of the house was a chaotic mess of empty champagne bottles, discarded party streamers, and takeout containers, a bleak testament to the reckless lifestyle they had funded with stolen security. I didn't glance at the expensive leather furniture, the imported Persian rugs, or the high-end electronics they had rushed to display. None of it had ever belonged to their character. It was merely borrowed glitter. I walked straight through the living room and headed directly for the garage. In the dim corner, sitting right beside a stack of recycling boxes, was my old wooden sewing box and the crumpled plastic bag holding the vintage lace wedding dress Chloe had contemptuously tossed aside earlier that week as garbage. I knelt down, picked them up, and cradled them against my chest as if they were fragile glass. Those items held 32 years of my life, my dignity, and my survival. As I turned back toward the foyer, Greg came stumbling down the hallway. Before I could take another step, he collapsed onto his knees, throwing his arms around my ankles and burying his face in the hem of my coat, sobbing hysterically. Mẹ ơi, cho con một cơ hội làm lại, he choked out, his voice breaking into desperate, pathetic gasps. Con lại mẹ, xin mẹ đừng bỏ con hứa sẽ thay đổi. I stood entirely still, looking down at the son I had raised alone through endless winters, feeling the heavy, sorrowful finality settle deep inside my chest. I reached down, my fingers gently but firmly peeled his trembling hands away from my coat until his grip broke completely. Mẹ đã dành 32 năm nuôi con thành người, nhưng mẹ không thể dạy con lòng biết ơn khi con đã chọn bán nó đi. I answered quietly, my voice devoid of anger, carrying only the vast empty space where a mother's patience used to live. Chìa khóa nhà thu lại, từ nay hãy tự sống bằng đôi tay của mình. I stepped past him, pulled the front door shut behind me with a solid echoing click, and walked down the steps toward the Cadillac, leaving the past locked firmly behind us, knowing the true reckoning had finally reached its end. The keys to the Elmwood Drive estate were officially back in my possession, but I had no intention of ever sleeping in that hollow house of bitter memories and cold betrayal. With the overwhelming financial security of the multi-million-dollar trust firmly behind me, I made a definitive choice that permanently altered the landscape and the spirit of that quiet Irvine neighborhood. I did not put the $850,000 house on the market to cash out quickly, nor did I move into its empty master suite alone to rattle around in lingering sorrow. Instead, I utilized a fraction of the capital to purchase the surrounding parcels of land and buildings, completely transforming the entire residential property into a fully funded vocational training center dedicated exclusively to single mothers, domestic abuse survivors, and vulnerable women striving to rebuild their broken lives from scratch. We officially named it the Dignity Stitch Academy, a sanctuary built on the sweat of honest labor. Out by the main entrance, where the manicured lawn met the quiet concrete sidewalk, a sturdy oak sign now stood tall, carved lovingly by Mateo's calloused, faithful hands. The words, etched deep into the wood, served as a quiet, unyielding warning to anyone who walked past. A needle and thread can mend a torn garment, but greed and ingratitude can never be repaired. Earn your dignity with your own two hands. My daily life quieted down into something deeply grounding, purposeful, and profoundly peaceful. I moved into a warm, sunlit loft apartment built directly above the main workshop, where the air always smelled of fresh cotton and ambition. Every single morning, the familiar rhythmic hum of Singer sewing machines filled the air as Mrs. Rosa, Mateo, and I guided dozens of eager students through the intricate art of pattern making, cutting, and tailoring. We weren't just teaching them how to thread a needle or operate a heavy machine. We were teaching them how to stand firmly on their own 2 feet, ensuring no woman would ever have to depend on the fickle mercy of ungrateful family members or selfish relatives. To secure their futures permanently, I allocated $50 million from the trust to establish the Handcraft Labor Scholarship Fund, guaranteeing that financial hardship would never bar anyone from learning a respectable trade. Sitting by the wide window of my loft on a golden Sunday afternoon, the warm California sunlight spilled across the polished wooden table where my old sewing machine rested. The steel needle moved up and down with steady, practiced grace, guiding a bright thread through a piece of durable fabric. I looked out at the courtyard below, watching mothers laugh with their children and students proudly holding up their first completed garments. A profound, unshakable calm settled over my chest, wiping away the final remnants of the pain I had carried for so long through all those cold winters. I leaned back from the machine, looking directly out toward the horizon as I delivered the final truth of my journey. The greatest revenge is not making someone kneel at your feet with all the money you possess. The greatest revenge is when you rise from the ruins, keeping your kindness and dignity intact, and use them to light up the lives of others. Never wait until your suitcase is thrown out onto the street to go searching for your own self-worth. The machine clicked softly to a final stop, the thread tied off securely at the end, and the story of my life finally found its true, unbreakable design.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.